Okay, good day to everybody. I think we'll get started. Let me just quickly introduce myself before we get going. My name is DC. I am a TS with K2, and what we're going to have a look at today is really K2 workflow applications with forms and data, and all of that is going to run within the SharePoint 2013 environment. So the agenda for today is we'll start off by just having a quick look at some of the usual challenges that people face when they work with SharePoint, and they actually want to go and expand on that. Typically, there's a couple of common use cases that we've noticed that our clients have when they work with SharePoint, so we'll have a quick look at those, and you guys can also decide which area you kind of fit in. We'll go and give you a quick overview of the K2 platform, and once you're familiar with the platform and then the typical use cases, we'll dive right back into a demo where we're going to show you how to go ahead and build that out. Finally, we'll have a session, a couple of minutes for Q&A, just to make sure that everybody gets their questions answered. As we go through the slides in the demo, excuse me, feel free to start typing out any questions that you have in the window. Right at the end, when we have a look at the Q&A section, you can also type it right there, but also go and run through some of the questions that we have gathered throughout the session. Okay. So a lot of people, and in fact, 73% of people who use SharePoint like to have workflow-driven applications, because SharePoint's a very nice fit in the sense that it contains a lot of data, a lot of information that is kind of critical to the business applications that they have, and that's a nice source to drive the workflow applications. Problem that they face typically, however, is that integration is a very big challenge. In fact, 62% of people cite that that's the biggest challenge that they face when they want to go and use SharePoint and then have the workflow that drive behind all of that. The second biggest problem that people face is the time and effort to build these applications, because you need a specific skill set to make sure that you get a valid application, something that works well, and it kind of resonates with the users that actually use that application. And then hand in hand with that, end user interface is a kind of a challenge, because again, you need resources to understand what they're doing. It needs to be well-oiled. It needs to be something that the users can work with. It's not going to be overly complex. It's not going to be very heavy. It should be responsive, and it should be very, very easy to use. So these are the typical challenges that folks face. And in having said that, we also identified two main ways that people work with SharePoint, and especially SharePoint and then the applications that they build around that. The first one is where the items, the content inside of SharePoint, things like your SharePoint list items, the documents that you upload, those are really the core driver behind the actual application that runs. The second pillar, or the second option that we typically see, is that the workflow and the forms are really the main drivers, and then SharePoint acts more of a line of business system that really just integrates and participates in that application that they have. A very easy way to distinguish this would be to say, in the first case, if we now go and remove that list item or the document from SharePoint, the forms and the workflows that we have doesn't really make sense, right? It kind of dies away because it has no use. Whereas if we take away SharePoint in the as a line of business system, the application might not be as good and as solid as it could be, but the forms and the workflows still make sense. It's just missing a little bit of the data that we have there. If you have a look at the SharePoint-centric side, you also see that there are two main distinctions of how typically people will go ahead and use that. First is people really just care about the workflow. The forms that come out of the box with SharePoint is enough. It doesn't need to be overly complex. They just want to go and capture a set of data that they will save inside that list or metadata for the document itself. And all they care about is to send that through the proper approval steps, and then basically that translates to the workflow that we have. The inverse to that is where we go ahead and work with something that's a little bit more, I don't want to call it complex, but let's say a little bit more involved, because we care about the workflow, sure, but we also want to go and create forms that give us more than just the out-of-the-box SharePoint forms, right? Something that pulls in line of business data, something that supports the decisions that the people need to make as part of the workflow, right? So it kind of spazzes up the forms a little bit more bells and whistles. And then the line of business side of SharePoint, and this is really, like I said, the business application is the main driver. So we're going to automate something. It needs to have a certain set of rules associated with it. It needs to take a certain path before we can make a proper decision. And SharePoint is really just a way for us to support that business application. So it will go and display data. We can attach documents supporting the decisions that we made, or maybe just a request that needs to go and approve. And we can also obviously go and make certain routing decisions, or just decisions within the workflow. Things like, I want to go and send my task to user X, Y, and Z, and that gets pulled back